Hello? Tonight, we are going to travel to a version of Earth so old that the shape of the world would barely make sense to modern eyes. Imagine standing on land that seems to go on forever, with no familiar oceans cutting the horizon into separate worlds. Only one immense body of Earth resting beneath a single wide sky. If calm journeys through deep time are something you enjoy, you can subscribe and stay with me for more. And if this quiet kind of storytelling helps you unwind, a gentle like is always appreciated. Now, let everything slow down a little. Let your breathing settle into an easy rhythm. There is nowhere to rush to here. We are stepping into a world that moved at the pace of stone, water, and time. Long before cities, before coastlines like the ones we know, before the planet was divided into the continents that live so comfortably in the mind, there was another arrangement. Almost all the land on Earth had come together into one vast connected expanse. It is strange to imagine at first, because the modern map sits so firmly in memory. We learn it early. We return to it again and again. Yet, in this older world, that map had not been written yet. If you could have stood there, the first thing you might have noticed would be the scale. The land would not feel like a country, or even a continent. It would feel like the ground itself had forgotten where to stop. What we now call North America, Europe, Asia, Africa, and South America were not separated by long blue distances. They leaned into one another. They touched. They belonged to the same body of land. You could have walked across regions that are now oceans apart, and at no point would a ship have been needed. The silence of that realization is almost as large as the land itself. A familiar globe becomes something else entirely. The Atlantic is gone. The divisions you are used to have faded. There is no modern Pacific cutting an enormous emptiness across the planet. There is one continuous Earth, bordered not by many oceans, but by one immense global sea that wrapped around the supercontinent like a ring of moving blue. And yet, for all its size, this was not a quiet frozen museum of deep time. The Earth has never really known how to be still. Even then, beneath the stone and soil, the planet was at work. Continents had been pulled together by slow forces hidden far below the surface. Mountains had risen where crust met crust. Valleys had opened. Volcanoes had climbed upward and released fire and ash into ancient skies. If you had been standing there, watching the distant horizon in the late light, you might have seen a faint dark plume far away and understood that the world under your feet was alive in a very patient way. At the center of this enormous landmass, life unfolded under conditions that would feel severe to us. Distance from the sea changed everything. Moisture did not travel easily across such a colossal stretch of land. There were interior regions where rain could become a rare visitor, where the air remained dry for long periods, and where heat gathered across the ground through the day before slipping away into cold at night. Summers could grow intense. Winters could cut sharply. The seasons were not softened by nearby water. The sky over the interior must have felt immense, almost oversized, as if the horizon had been pushed very far back. You might picture bare emptiness, but that would only be part of the truth. Life was present everywhere, only shaped by different rules. In some places, thick vegetation spread across the land. In others, red deserts reached outward in long open waves. Forests stood where conditions allowed them. Strange reptiles moved through dust and shadow. Insects, in some periods, could grow far larger than the ones that drift past our windows now. The world was alive, but it was alive in an older language. One of the most remarkable qualities of this ancient earth was the absence of barriers. Today, oceans separate animals, climates, and forests from one another. In the age of the supercontinent, those boundaries were far fewer. A river could travel across lands that would one day become different continents, and never once be interrupted by a sea. Forests could spread across connected territories that are now broken apart by water. Species could move widely, following favorable conditions across a single joined landscape. It was, in a very real sense, one earth undivided. There is something almost peaceful about that image. One connected surface, one broad sky, one surrounding ocean. The same wind could travel over great distances of land. The same dust from an inland desert might settle far away near a wetter coastal forest. The same slow sunrise would touch a horizon not fractured by familiar coastlines, but stretched over one vast body of land. You can almost feel the deep breath of such a world. Still, the planet was not building permanence. The same forces that had assembled this world were never finished with it. Even while the land remained joined, the slow machinery below it continued to move. That is the quiet truth beneath all ancient landscapes. Mountains rise, and they wear down. Seas open, and later close. Continents meet, and much later they leave each other again. Nothing stays exactly as it seems. Not even stone. Before we can understand what it felt like to live in this connected world, it helps to pause and simply look around. Imagine standing somewhere far from the coast, so far that the scent of salt never arrives. The air is dry. The ground beneath your feet is hard and warm from the day. A range of mountains lies in the distance, softened by haze. Behind you are plains, perhaps a broad red land interrupted by shrubs, low plants, and a river glinting faintly in the light. In the evening, the temperature begins to drop. The sky clears further. The stars come forward in impossible numbers. There are no city lights. Of course, there are no ships, no roads, no boundaries marked by human thought. Only the patient architecture of a planet in one of its oldest arrangements. If you walked for days or months, the land would change slowly. That is one of the beautiful things about worlds this large. Change would not arrive like a sudden border. It would come as a long transition. Dry land might soften into woodland. Woodland might thicken into forest. A river valley might widen and gather life along its banks. Farther on, perhaps after a very long journey, the air would begin to hold more moisture. Breezes would shift. The pull of the great surrounding ocean would be felt again. Clouds would gather more often. Wet ground would replace dust. Insects would hum in denser numbers. Amphibians and reptiles would find easier shelter near the water. The land would still be one, but not monotonous. It carried many climates inside itself. That contrast between the outer margins and the interior made this world especially dramatic in a quiet geological way. Along the coasts, the sea had influence. It carried moisture inland. It moderated temperature. It fed wetlands, forests, and river systems. Farther inside, the reach of that ocean faded. Rain became scarce. The earth baked and cooled in stronger seasonal swings. The same continent held both abundance and austerity, both humid edges and stern inner expanses. It was a world of gradients rather than neat divisions. And through all of it, beneath every forest and desert, the crust remained restless. This matters, because it means the world of the supercontinent was never only a scene to admire. It was also a process. Mountains rose because continents had met. Volcanoes erupted because the planet below was active. Valleys formed because stone was being pulled and folded and pressed. Even the rivers were part of a bigger story, carrying minerals away from fresh highlands, shaping plains, feeding distant ecosystems. Pangea was not simply a place. It was the visible expression of deep movement. Scientists believe that when nearly all land came together in this way, the climate of the whole planet changed with it. Air currents moved differently across such a massive joined surface. Dust could travel immense distances. Seasonal patterns may have become more intense in some regions. The arrangement of land and sea helped decide where forests would flourish, where deserts would spread, and where life would find easier paths forward. In other words, geography was not merely a backdrop. It was one of the main authors of the story. If you were there, and if you had the patience to sit very still, the world might feel almost too large to understand. There would be no familiar coastline nearby to tell you where things ended. No neat edge to comfort the eye. Only long land, distant mountains, the occasional river, and a sky that seemed to arch without interruption over an ancient connected earth. It might have felt lonely at first, then perhaps not lonely at all. Perhaps simply spacious. That may be the most unusual quality of this old world. It asks us to think beyond the tidy separations of the present. It asks us to imagine a planet where animals could move across joined lands, where forests stretched through regions that are now strangers to one another, and where the memory of division had not yet formed. The earth we know today is broken into pieces by water. The earth of Pangea was gathered together, vast and whole, though only for a while. And that, while matters, because this ancient union left marks that have never fully disappeared. The foundations of modern mountains, the spread of early life, the deep logic of certain fossils found oceans apart, all of these were shaped in part by that temporary wholeness. The world we live on still carries the memory of it, even if the shape itself is gone. So, before we go any farther into deserts, forests, rivers, and creatures, we need to move one step deeper. We need to ask how the earth managed to gather itself into one great land at all. Because the making of this world did not begin with a sudden event. It began with motion so slow that no eye could have watched it happen. Only stone could remember it. And in that patient movement, the real beginning of this story waits. Long before the world became a single joined land, the surface of Earth was arranged very differently. It was a patchwork of drifting continents, older oceans, island chains, shallow seas, and restless boundaries that shifted so slowly no living creature could have felt the full shape of the change. Yet over spans of time so long that they almost slipped past imagination, those fragments began to move toward one another. The ground beneath us feels steady in everyday life. It gives the impression of permanence. But the crust of Earth is broken into enormous plates, and those plates glide over softer, hotter material deep below. The motion is gradual, measured in tiny distances over a year, so small that it would seem almost laughable if the consequences were not so immense. Give the planet enough time, and a movement no faster than fingernails can rearrange oceans, build mountains, and turn scattered lands into a single supercontinent. This had happened before. Pangea was not the first gathering of the continents, only one chapter in a much older rhythm. Scientists speak of earlier supercontinents. Ancient names carried mostly by geology rather than popular memory. Rodinia, Nuna. Other older unions of land that formed, broke apart, and left their fragments to wander again. There is something gentle about that repetition. Earth tries one arrangement, then another. It collects its pieces, scatters them, and much later collects them again. By the late Paleozoic era, several large continental masses were already moving across the planet in slow, deliberate paths. Laurentia, Gondwana, Baltica, Siberia, and other blocks of land existed as separate presences, each with its own climates, coastlines, and histories. They were not yet one world, but they were no longer moving without consequence. The distances between them were shrinking. Oceans lying between them began to narrow. Shores that had once faced open water were gradually turned toward collision. You might imagine this as a dramatic crash, but that would give the wrong feeling. The assembly of Pangea was not one loud impact. It was a patient closing. A long geological conversation between stone masses drifting for millions of years. As these continents approached one another, the seas between them grew smaller. Island arcs were caught in the middle. Shallow waters disappeared. Sediments piled up. Pressure increased. At times, entire oceans were slowly erased. One of those vanished waters lay between landmasses that would later help form the supercontinent. Over countless ages, the ocean floor was consumed. The gap narrowed, and the margins of the continents drew closer until eventually land met land. When that happened, the crust did not slide neatly into place. It buckled. It folded. It thickened. Rocks that had rested quietly under ancient seas were lifted high into mountain belts. This is one of the great quiet miracles of tectonics. Mountains are, in part, memories of collision, where land once met land with unstoppable force. Ranges rose skyward. The Appalachians in North America preserve some of that history. So do ancient structures linked to parts of North Africa and Europe. Though the Atlantic now lies between them, Their older roots tell a story of contact. Once they were part of the same systems, raised when continents pressed together in the making of a single Earth. If you could have looked down from far above during these ages, the world would have appeared strange and beautiful. Great landmasses would have been creeping inward across a globe dominated by a vast surrounding ocean. Pantalas, the immense global sea, stretched around the assembling continents. Alongside it, smaller, older seas still lingered in sheltered regions, remnants of earlier arrangements not yet fully closed. The contrast must have been striking. On one side, the broad ring of open ocean. On the other, continents inching toward union. While the land moved, the climate moved with it. This is easy to forget. But continents do not travel alone. They carry weather patterns, ocean circulation, wind systems, and living communities into new relationships. Parts of Gondwana, for example, held evidence of ancient glaciation. Ice-marked regions that would one day become South America, Africa, and Antarctica. At the same time, other places nearer the equator supported warm, wet lowlands. Cold and warmth existed together on the same planet, as they always do. But the shifting positions of continents slowly redrew the boundaries between them. As mountains rose from collision, they changed the air above them. They redirected winds. They gathered rain on one side and left dry shadows on the other. Rivers formed in new highlands and carried fresh minerals into basins and lowlands. Valleys opened. Sediments accumulated. The landscape was not only being assembled, it was being textured. Every collision brought topography. Every topography changed climate. Every climate reshaped the possibilities for life. In some northern regions, broad swampy lowlands spread beneath humid air. Dense forests of primitive plants grew there in abundance. Their remains, buried and compressed over ages, would later become coal seams far beneath modern ground. The atmosphere in some of these times is thought to have held more oxygen than today, which may have helped support giant insects and thriving wetland ecosystems. Dragonflies of extraordinary size moved over the water. Arthropods, much larger than modern ones, crossed the forest floor. It was a world rich with experiment. Elsewhere, farther south, the planet told another story. Cold landscapes lay under ice. Glaciers moved slowly across parts of Gondwana, scratching stone and leaving marks that geologists can still read. These frozen regions existed at the same time as warm equatorial forests. That contrast is one of the most humbling things about ancient Earth. While one part of the world steamed with plant life, another remained in the grip of long, cold conditions. The planet was never one mood. And still the continents moved. As the remaining distances narrowed, larger blocks of land came together in phases. Earlier unions linked some regions first, creating broader continental masses that then collided with others. Smaller tyrannies and island chains were trapped in between and folded into the growing whole. Imagine pieces of cloth drifting on dark water, slowly drawing together until their edges meet and wrinkle upward. It is not a perfect comparison, but it captures something of the softness of the motion and the violence hidden inside its consequences. When the final great closures took place, the map of the Earth began to simplify. What had once been a scattered arrangement became a single, enormous expanse. Nearly all the planet's land was now fused into one body. Around it, Panthalassa reached outward in every direction. Along one margin, an inland sea still lingered, a remnant of older oceans not yet entirely gone. But the main truth had already arrived. The world had gathered itself together. It is almost impossible to overstate how much this changed the character of the planet. Distance meant something new now. Coasts that had once moderated separate continents now framed one immense interior. Rivers could run across joined lands. Winds could travel great stretches without interruption. Species that had once been isolated from one another could now disperse more freely. Mountain belts linked formerly distant regions. The Earth had not merely rearranged its surface. It had rewritten the conditions under which climate and life would unfold. If you had stood on newly formed Pangea in those early ages of completion, you might not have sensed the grand map at first. You would have sensed the local world around you. Fresh mountains, perhaps, rugged and young. Wide valleys carrying runoff from highlands. Basins collecting sediment. Wetlands in some places, drying plains in others. But if you kept walking, and walking, and walking, the larger truth would begin to reveal itself. The land did not give way to another continent across water. It simply continued. This is where the making of Pangaea becomes more than a tectonic event. It becomes a change in atmosphere, in weather, in the feel of distance itself. The interior of such a landmass sat very far from the moderating touch of the sea. That meant harsher seasonal swings in some places, greater dryness in others, and the beginning of those vast continental interiors that would later become one of the defining features of the supercontinent. The deserts were not fully the story yet, but their foundations were being laid. The coasts, meanwhile, remained gentler by comparison. Here, the surrounding ocean still carried moisture inland. Forests could thrive more easily. River systems spread through lowland basins. Shallow marine environments along continental shelves supported marine life. The edges and center of the supercontinent were already beginning to live by different rules. In a sense, as soon as Pangaea formed, it also began dividing itself into internal worlds, humid margins, dry interiors, transitional belts in between. It is interesting to imagine how long all of this took from the perspective of life living through it. No animal would wake one morning and notice that a supercontinent had formed. The change was far too slow for that. Generations came and went. Forests spread and retreated. Rivers shifted course. Mountain peaks rose and were worn down. The world always seemed normal to the creatures living in it, because every age feels ordinary from the inside. Only when we stand far back, with stone records and fossil clues gathered across continents, does the pattern become visible. And visible it is. Ancient mountain chains match across separated lands. Rock layers line up. Fossils appear in places now divided by oceans. These clues are quiet, but together they speak clearly. Once, these regions were not apart. Once, the land was joined. Once, Earth carried its continents close together in one of the most remarkable arrangements in its history. As the assembly settled into completion, the planet entered a new chapter. The long collisions had done their work. The seams of union remained in the crust. Mountains stood where oceans had closed. Basin after basin held the sediments of changing rivers and shifting climates. Great stretches of land now shared the same connected foundation. Pangaea was no longer only becoming. It had become. And with that becoming finished, another kind of story began. A geological story can sound abstract until it starts shaping the air, the forests, the deserts, and the creatures walking through them. Now that the world was gathered into one great continent, its true character could emerge. Coasts would breathe under ocean winds. The interior would harden into dry vastness. Rivers would tie distant ecosystems together. Life would expand across the open land in ways that had not been possible before. So the slow assembly of Pangaea was never only about land meeting land. It was about preparing a stage. It built the mountains that would cast rain shadows. It created the basins that would collect water and life. It redrew the climate of the planet. It opened corridors across once divided worlds. And in doing so, it made possible the strange, beautiful, severe continent that would come next. One world under one sky, with deserts in its heart and forests along its living edges. With the continents now gathered into one immense body of land, the meaning of distance began to change. In the modern world, it is easy to think of distance as something measured between coastlines, or across oceans, or from one country to another. On Pangaea, distance had a different feeling. It stretched across the land itself. You could move for weeks beneath the same uninterrupted sky and still remain on the same connected earth. If you had stood somewhere near the center of that world, you would not have seen the signs that help us place ourselves today. No nearby coast. No clean edge between one landmass and another. No sense that another continent waited somewhere beyond the water. There was only land, open and continuous, reaching farther than the eye could manage. In some directions, the ground would have risen toward distant mountains. In others, it would have flattened into plains, then softened into woodland, then changed again, slowly, patiently, over great spans of space. That is one of the quiet wonders of this ancient arrangement. Pangaea was unified, but it was never simple. It was one connected land. Yet inside that wholeness, it carried many worlds. The edges and the center lived under very different conditions, and the shift between them was often gradual, almost gentle, as if the continent were breathing from wet to dry, from lush to austere. Along the outer margins, the surrounding ocean still had a voice. Winds came ashore carrying moisture from Panthalassa, and in places that moisture fed wetlands, floodplains, and long belts of forest. The coasts were places of change, movement, and abundance. Tides worked at the edges of the land. Rivers widened as they approached low ground. The air held more softness. There would have been the smell of wet soil, shallow water warming in the light, and plant life pressing closely together wherever conditions allowed. In some regions, the line between land and water may have been difficult to define from a distance. Broad tidal flats, marshy margins, river mouths, and shallow basins created landscapes where still pools reflected the sky, and reeds or primitive plants gathered in quiet green density. Amphibians would have favored such places. Insects, too. Life near the coasts often had the advantage of water arriving regularly, either from rain or from river systems fed farther inland. It is pleasant to linger there for a moment, because the coastal world of Pangaea must often have felt surprisingly rich. Dense forests of seed ferns and early conifer-like plants stood in some of these wetter belts. In low areas, damp ground collected layers of fallen plant matter that would one day be buried and changed into coal. Riverbanks would have remained active with movement. There is a kind of peaceful busyness to wet places. Not frantic, just steady. Leaves shifting. Water passing over stones. Insects moving through warm air. Small animals appearing and disappearing between shade and light. If you followed one of those river systems inland, the transformation would not happen all at once. That is important to remember. Ancient landscapes of this scale did not tend to change like a door opening and closing. They changed like weather across a long afternoon. First, the forests might thin slightly. The ground between trees would widen. The air would still hold moisture, but less of it. Open woodlands could begin to appear, with wider spaces between trunks and more sky visible above. Farther on, the woodland might give way to plains, where grasses as we know them were not yet the main story, but open plant-covered ground still spread across broad distances. These transitional zones may have been some of the most important regions on the entire supercontinent. They were not as wet as the coasts, and not as severe as the deep interior. They were the in-between spaces. Corridors. Gradual landscapes where species could move, adapt, and continue traveling. Animals did not need to leap from one isolated ecosystem to another. They could drift through these broad changing belts over generations, following rivers, favorable climate, and available food. The land itself offered a pathway. Scientists believe this connected geography helps explain why similar fossils appear across continents that are now far apart. A reptile living in one part of the supercontinent could slowly spread across connected habitats over immense periods of time. Plants, too, could follow the long, uninterrupted surfaces of floodplain, forest belt, and river margin. It was a world where movement did not always require crossing barriers. Often, it only required patience. Continue inland, and another shift begins. The ocean's influence starts to fade. Rain becomes less dependable. The ground grows drier. Seasonal swings become stronger. What had once been soft underfoot begins to harden, and the wide gentleness of transitional woodland opens into a more exposed landscape. Here, the scale of the continent revealed one of its most defining traits. Its heart lay so far from the sea that moisture often could not reach it in meaningful amounts. And so the great interior of Pangaea became a land of dryness on a scale difficult to picture now. These were not small deserts. They were not scattered patches of sand bordered by easy relief. They were enormous dry regions stretching across vast distances, sometimes interrupted by rocky uplands, seasonal waterways, or isolated ribbons of more favorable ground. The rocks left behind from such places tell part of the story. Red beds, iron-stained layers formed in hot, dry conditions, are still found across lands that once belonged to the supercontinent. They are quiet evidence of immense interiors where heat, oxidation, and long arid seasons shaped the land. If you had walked there by day, the light would have felt hard and spacious. The sun would have carried more weight on the skin. The ground might shimmer in the distance. Colors would have simplified into reds, browns, pale stone, and the muted greens of hardy plants clinging where they could. Wind would have been more noticeable in open places, sweeping across exposed ground and carrying dust over long reaches with little to stop it. There is a kind of ancient honesty in such a landscape. Nothing hidden, except perhaps the life that had learned not to waste itself in daylight. And still, even here, the world was not empty. That is one of the comforting truths of Earth history. Harshness does not mean absence. Plants adapted. Some sent roots deep in search of water. Others hardened their leaves and conserved what little moisture they could hold. Small reptiles and early mammal-like creatures found ways to endure heat and cold, often by timing their activity carefully, resting in shade, sheltering in burrows, or staying close to the rare routes where water appeared. In a world this large, survival often belonged to flexibility rather than strength alone. The air of the interior must have felt different from the coasts in almost every way. During the day it could be heavy with warmth, but very dry. At night, without clouds or nearby water to hold the heat, the temperature might fall sharply. Under those conditions, the stars would have seemed extraordinarily vivid. You can imagine a silence there that is difficult to find now. No waves, no forest chorus. Only wind, perhaps, and the occasional faint movement of an animal adapted to distance and scarcity. Yet even this dryness was not cut off from the rest of the continent. Dust raised from the interior could travel outward, carried by winds toward wetter regions. In time, that dust may have helped deliver minerals to distant ecosystems. Rare storms forming along the margins of the dry lands could push weather outward or inward depending on the season. Seasonal rivers might briefly awaken parts of the desert, drawing life from every direction for a short, precious interval. Water, even when scarce, still connected. That theme of connection runs through everything on Pangea. Coast and interior were different, but not separate. The forests depended on rivers fed by mountains and rainfall. The rivers carried sediments out from the highlands. The interior sent dust toward the edges. The wind moved over all of it. One part of the supercontinent could influence another from very far away, simply because there was no great ocean to interrupt the relationship. It was one enormous system, varied yet continuous. And then there were the mountains. These ranges, raised by the old continental collisions that built Pangea, were not merely scenery on the horizon. They shaped the movement of air and water across the land. Their slopes gathered runoff. Their shadows could leave one side wetter and another much drier. Rivers born in their heights wandered across the lowlands and became lifelines. Over time, erosion wore their rock down grain by grain, sending sediment into plains, deltas, and inland basins. Even the quiet work of wearing away helped stitch the continent together. Traveling across this world would have meant passing through environmental change as though reading a long, slow book. Wet coastal forests, broad floodplains, open woodland, dry plains, great interior deserts. Then perhaps, after extraordinary distance, mountain-influenced lands or another moisture-bearing margin. The beauty of the journey would not be in sudden surprise. It would be in the steadiness of transformation. The earth does some of its finest work very slowly. It is strange to imagine how large the sky must have felt above such a world. Modern landscapes often carry a sense of edge. A shore, a ridge, a city, something that tells the eye where to rest. On Pangaea, especially away from mountains and forest, the eye may have traveled much farther before finding an answer. This added to the emotional scale of the place. The land felt large because it was large, but it also felt larger because so much of it remained visually open. And still, for all this openness, life was able to spread in remarkable ways. Rivers offered guidance. Transitional belts offered shelter. Wet margins offered abundance. Dry interiors tested endurance. The result was not one uniform ecosystem, but a network of connected environments across which species could move and diversify. In that sense, Pangaea was less like one single habitat and more like one immense woven fabric, with wetter threads, drier threads, elevated seams, and open spaces all touching each other. If you stood quietly at sunset in one of those in-between places, not fully coast and not yet desert, you might have seen the essence of the supercontinent most clearly. A river moving slowly through a broad plain. A line of darker trees following the water. Dry land beyond. A faint mountain chain in the distance. Wind moving the leaves nearest the bank while dust lifted farther away. Two worlds almost touching, and yet not truly separate. The coastal softness and the inland severity held together on one shared earth. That was the truth of Pangaea. A borderless world, but not a featureless one. A connected land, but one rich in contrast. It gave room for forests to flourish and deserts to expand, for rivers to carry life across immense distances, and for climate to reveal how far the sea could reach before the interior took over. And as this great continent breathed through wet seasons and dry ones, through stillness and wind, another force continued shaping it from all sides. The ocean that surrounded everything, and the air moving above both sea and land, were already preparing the next layer of the story. Around the great body of Pangaea stretched an ocean so vast that it is difficult to imagine without falling quiet for a moment. Pangaea surrounded the supercontinent on all sides, a nearly global sea reaching toward every horizon beyond the land. It was not simply a backdrop, not just a border drawn in blue around the edges of a map. It was one of the main forces shaping the climate. The air, the coastlines, and the rhythm of life itself. To stand at the shore of that ancient ocean would have been a very different experience from standing at most coastlines today. There would have been no thought of another familiar continent just beyond the curve of the globe. No sense of nearby islands filled with people, ports, and names. Only open water, immense and uninterrupted, breathing against the edge of a world that held nearly all the land in one place. The waves would still have arrived in their patient sequence. Of course, sea after sea folding toward the shore. The language of water does not need modern geography to remain recognizable. Along those coasts, the ocean softened the climate. Moisture rose from the sea and traveled inland on the wind, feeding belts of greener land near the margins of the supercontinent. Rivers gathered that water and spread it farther across floodplains and low ground. Wetlands formed. Forests thickened. The difference between coastal life and inland life often began with that simple exchange. Water lifted from ocean, carried through air, and returned to the earth as rain. In some places, warm, shallow seas spread over low-lying continental margins. These zones may have extended for great distances, creating broad marine shelves where sunlight reached easily into the water. Such places are often generous to life. Reefs formed in some ancient seas. Early fish moved through clear shallows. Invertebrates lived across the seabed, filtering nutrients from the water. It is thought that these coastal marine environments were among the richest on the planet, nourished by the meeting of land and sea. Rivers played a quiet role in this abundance. They carried minerals and sediments from mountains and inland basins toward the coast, feeding estuaries, deltas, and shallow waters. Dust from the dry interior may also have found its way seaward, adding another slow gift from the center of the continent to the ocean's edge. This exchange is one of the lovely patterns that repeats throughout Earth history. Nothing exists entirely alone. Mountains feed rivers. Rivers feed seas. Seas feed clouds. Clouds return to land. The whole system turns without hurry. There was also another sea, smaller than Pangaea, but deeply important, lying along part of Pangea's margin. The Paleotethys remained as a lingering body of water, a remnant of older oceanic worlds not yet fully closed away. Compared with the open immensity of Pangaea, it may have offered more sheltered marine conditions in some regions, a place where shallow habitats and evolving communities could persist under different circumstances. The supercontinent did not face the ocean in only one way. Its water world had variety too. If the coast was where ocean and land exchanged gifts, then the atmosphere was where those relationships were carried farther. The air above Pangaea was not passive. It moved with purpose. On a planet where nearly all land had gathered into one mass, wind patterns behaved differently from the way they do now. The arrangement of continents matters to air. It decides where heat builds, where moisture travels, and where storms have room to grow. Pangaea, by its very shape, encouraged vast atmospheric systems. Warm air rising over heated land in some regions could draw moisture in from the surrounding ocean. This likely helped create powerful seasonal monsoons along parts of the supercontinent. During wet seasons, heavy rains would arrive over certain coastal zones and lowlands, filling rivers and renewing forests. In the dry season, those same places might retreat into calmer stillness. The pulsing exchange between rain and drought would have shaped plant life, animal movement, and the feel of time itself. It is peaceful to imagine the beginning of one of those wet seasons, clouds building offshore, slowly at first, then gathering with more confidence, the air becoming heavier, softer, full of the scent that comes just before rain. Then water arriving in long, steady curtains, striking leaves, darkening soil, swelling streams, and feeding backwaters where amphibians and insects could flourish. For the coasts of Pangaea, these rains were not small comforts. They were one of the main architects of life. Farther inland, the story changed. The same winds that arrived moist near the shore lost their water as they traveled across the continent. By the time air masses reached the deep interior, much of their moisture had already fallen away. What remained was drier air, descending into regions already prone to heat and scarcity. This is one reason the contrast between coasts and interior became so strong. It was not merely that the center was far from the sea. It was that the atmosphere itself had been spent on the journey inward. Wind, then, became one of the great sculptors of the supercontinent. Near the coast, it carried life-giving moisture. Over the interior, it lifted dust and drove it across exposed lands. Across mountains, it rose and cooled, dropping rain on one side and leaving a dry shadow on the other. At the shore, it salted the air and bent the tops of coastal vegetation. In forests, it moved softly through branches. Over deserts, it hissed low against the ground and reshaped loose sediment grain by grain. There is something soothing about thinking of wind as the voice of a continent. If you had listened carefully in different regions of Pangaea, you might have heard very different versions of the same element. Near wetlands, a soft movement through reeds. In conifer stands, a higher whisper passing between branches. Over exposed plains, a broad, open sweep. In the interior deserts, a dry rasp over stone and sand. The planet spoke in many accents, but all of them moved through the same shared air. The composition of that air was not always the same as it is now. During some phases near the late Carboniferous, oxygen levels may have been higher than those of the modern atmosphere. That extra oxygen is thought to have supported larger arthropods and may have contributed to the giant insects often associated with these ancient ages. Later, during parts of the Permian, oxygen levels appear to have fallen. To a modern human, breathing under those conditions might have felt different, perhaps more demanding in certain times and places. But the living things of that world were shaped to fit the air they had. Carbon dioxide also mattered deeply. Volcanic activity released it into the atmosphere, helping warm the planet over long intervals. In forested regions, plants drew it in and returned oxygen. The atmosphere was not separate from the living world. It was constantly being altered by geology and biology together. Volcanoes changed the air. Forests changed it back. Climate shifted. Life adapted. The cycle continued. Even the appearance of the sky may not always have matched what we are used to. During times of stronger volcanic activity, fine aerosols and ash could dim the light or tint sunsets in unusual ways. Imagine an evening over the interior of Pangaea, the dry land still warm from the day, while the sinking sun glows through a veil of suspended particles, turning the horizon copper, then red, then a muted purple. On clearer days, the sky might have seemed harder and deeper. especially above the desert, where little moisture softened the air. At night, the contrast would have been just as striking. Along the coasts, humid air and cloud systems might sometimes blur the stars. But over the arid interior, the sky would open with extraordinary sharpness. Countless points of light, a dark so complete it feels almost physical. You might notice how small you feel in a peaceful way under such a canopy. The same air that carried monsoon clouds over one region carried silence and stars over another. Storms must also have played their part in the atmosphere of Pangea. With large, uninterrupted stretches of land and strong seasonal heating, thunderstorms could grow to impressive size. Near the coasts, they may have released torrents of rain, drumming on the forest canopy and turning quiet channels into surging water. Farther inland, some storm systems may have weakened before they could give much relief, their dark clouds passing overhead with more promise than fulfillment. Even disappointment, in nature, has its own beauty. And above all of this, the atmosphere linked places that never saw one another directly. Dust from the interior could travel outward and settle in distant wetlands. Moisture from the ocean could drift inland until it vanished into heat. Volcanic gases from one region could alter conditions elsewhere. Air was the invisible thread binding mountain, forest, desert, river, and sea into a single moving system. On Pangaea, with so much land joined together, that thread stretched farther than it does now. If you were standing where forest met coast, you might have felt the whole system at once. Ocean wind on your face, damp soil underfoot, clouds building in the distance, the smell of vegetation warmed by passing light. Somewhere inland, rivers carrying minerals from high ground. Somewhere farther still, dry lands lifting dust into the same sky above you. It would all be connected, whether visible or not. That is perhaps the most calming way to understand this ancient planet. Not as separate pieces, but as one large breathing arrangement. The ocean gave moisture to the air. The air gave rain to the land. The land gave rivers to the sea. Deserts sent dust outward. Forests fed the atmosphere. Volcanoes added heat and haze. Nothing acted alone for long. Every movement of water or wind joined a pattern older than any creature walking beneath it. And so the coasts of Pangaea were never just edges. They were meeting places. The beginning of rain. The end of rivers. The home of shallow seas. The part of the world where the breath of the planet was easiest to feel. From there, the air carried the story inland, and the inland world sent something back in return. One continent, one great ocean, one moving atmosphere, all speaking quietly to one another through light, water, and time. Across the vast connected lands of Pangaea, life did not spread evenly. It gathered where water lingered, where roots could hold the soil, where rivers slowed just enough to feed floodplains and wetlands, and where the climate allowed green things to rise in layers toward the light. In these places, the supercontinent seemed to exhale. Forests formed the lungs of this ancient world, and rivers became its quiet arteries, carrying minerals, moisture, and movement across distances so large they almost stop feeling like distance at all. If you had entered one of those wetter regions at dawn, you might first have noticed the air. It would have felt heavier than the dry interior, softer on the skin, and filled with the scent of wet ground, resin, and slowly decaying plant matter. Mist may have rested above the low places. Water gathered in shallow channels. Leaves held droplets from the night. Somewhere beyond sight, a river would already be moving, not loudly, but steadily, making its way through roots, mud, and stone as it crossed the lowlands of a world not yet divided by modern seas. The forests of Pangea were not forests in the modern sense alone. They belonged to older botanical lineages, built from plants that would seem familiar only in fragments. Seed ferns spread broad fronds through humid regions, forming thick, living screens that shaded the ground below. Early conifer-like trees rose higher, their trunks lifting the canopy upward and creating vertical layers of life. In wetter zones, ancient horsetails and club mosses occupied floodplains and marshes, growing in dense stands beside waterlogged soil. It was a world of greens, but not the exact green of today. Stranger in structure, older in design, and patient in its abundance. Where forests thickened, sunlight became selective. It arrived in shafts and quiet patches. Some places would glow briefly in morning light, then fade again beneath moving shadow. The ground might feel springy underfoot, with generations of plant matter slowly returning to the soil. Fallen fronds, broken stems, spores, damp bark, all of it collecting in layers over immense spawns of time. Some of that buried plant material would become the coal seams still hidden beneath parts of the present-day continents. In a sense, these forests left behind stored sunlight. And yet they were not silent. Insects moved through them in tremendous variety. During some ages, when oxygen levels were higher, certain arthropods reached sizes that would look almost exaggerated now, as though nature had briefly allowed itself a little mischief. Giant dragonflies glided over waterways with measured confidence. Millipede-like creatures crossed the damp forest floor beneath the canopy. Smaller insects gathered in leaf litter, along bark, near stagnant pools, and in the warm, still air above the mud. Their movements, taken together, would have made the forest feel quietly busy, never rushed, only alive. The rivers gave these forests structure. Many of them began high in mountain systems, raised long ago by the collisions that formed the supercontinent. Snowmelt in cooler uplands, rainfall in wetter belts, and runoff from elevated terrain joined in streams that widened as they descended. Once on the plains, these waters slowed and spread. Channels braided, merged, and separated. Floodplains opened on either side. Seasonal overflow left rich sediments behind, and along those river margins, plant life flourished in generous belts that could stretch for astonishing distances. These river corridors may have been among the most important environments on Pangaea. They connected regions that would otherwise have felt isolated by dryness or elevation. They offered water in uncertain climates, food in leaner landscapes, and shade in open country. Animals followed them. Plants spread beside them. Sediments carried by them helped nourish ecosystems far from their mountain sources. If the coast was where land met sea, the river was where distant parts of the continent met one another. You can imagine standing beside one of those broad, ancient rivers in the late afternoon, the water moving slowly at the edge of the bank, a line of conifers behind you, fern-like growth spreading low across the ground, insects drifting above the shallows, tracks in the mud from creatures that came earlier to drink. There is a softness in such a place, even in deep time, a sense that life gathers where water chooses to linger. Amphibians would have favored these wetter worlds. In swamps, ponds, and river edges, they remained deeply tied to the water. Some were small and active in the shallows. Others were much larger, broad-bodied and still, waiting with patient, ancient focus. Their lives belonged partly to land and partly to water. And in these damp lowlands, that older way of living still worked well. For long stretches of time, the wetlands of Pangea gave amphibians everything they needed: breeding grounds, shelter, prey, and quiet cover beneath vegetation. But in the same forests and along the same riverbanks, another group was steadily expanding its possibilities. Reptiles, with their shelled eggs and greater freedom from water and reproduction, could move farther from the wetlands than amphibians easily could. This was one of the subtle turning points in the history of life on land. The amniotic egg did not arrive with thunder. It arrived with independence. It allowed animals to carry the conditions for early life with them, enclosed and protected, instead of always returning to standing water. In the forest margins and transitional belts, early reptiles moved through root systems, basked in patches of filtered light, and followed food into regions where amphibians were less comfortable. Many were still small, quick-bodied, close to the ground, alert, but their presence hinted at a future that had not yet fully arrived. They were testing dry land more completely. They were learning the geography of a connected continent. Among the most remarkable land animals of this age were the synapsids, the mammal-like creatures whose descendants would eventually lead by a very long road toward us. On Pangea, they came in many forms. Some were small and insect-eating. Some were sturdier herbivores, broad-bodied and slow-moving, built to process fibrous plants. Others were predators, with stronger jaws and more specialized teeth. They were not mammals, and not quite reptiles in the way we think of many later forms. They were part of an older experiment in terrestrial life, and for a time they thrived. There is something oddly touching about them in retrospect. These animals moved through fern-filled clearings and along floodplains without any sense of what their lineage might someday become. They were simply surviving their own world, a world of long river systems, changing climates, and connected habitats. Yet in their skulls, teeth, posture, and ways of feeding, some of the first hints of a more mammalian future were already present. The herbivorous forms may have wandered in groups through forest edges and wetter plains, clipping tough vegetation and relying on size for protection. Their bodies seem built for endurance rather than elegance. Thick through the middle, steady rather than swift. In a world where seasonal changes and long distances mattered, that kind of durability had value. Predatory synapsids, By contrast, followed movement. They would have worked the margins of rivers, forests, and open ground, using cover where it existed and patience where it did not. And all around them, the plant world continued shaping the atmosphere itself. Forests were not only scenery, they pulled carbon dioxide from the air and released oxygen. They held soil in place. They slowed water. They moderated local climates. Their shade preserved moisture. Their remains fed decomposers and enriched the ground. Every trunk, front, root, and spore took part in the quiet labor of making terrestrial ecosystems possible. Farther from the wettest zones, forests did not always vanish. They thinned. They changed character. In drier belts near the interior, hardier conifers and drought-tolerant plants became more common. Vegetation gathered along rivers and in places where groundwater remained close to the surface. Patches of green stood out against broader dryness. To an animal moving across Pangea, these would have been markers of survival. A strip of vegetation in the distance could mean shade, insects, prey, or fodder. A river valley could mean the difference between wandering and enduring. This is why the rivers mattered so much. They were not merely features on the landscape. They were pathways through climate itself. Along their banks, an animal might move from wetter forest into open plain, from plain into drier territory, and then back again toward another favorable zone, always following the thin and reliable thread of water. Over thousands of years, even large movements across the supercontinent could begin as simple habits of staying near rivers. Seasonality shaped these corridors too. During wetter periods, channels widened and floodplains spilled over. Water pooled into backwaters and temporary lakes. Plants surged. Insects multiplied. Tracks gathered in the mud. During drier periods, some channels narrowed, exposing bars of silt and stone. But even then, life concentrated where water remained. Scarcity did not empty these places. It organized them. If you were watching one of those river systems through an entire year, you might begin to understand the rhythm of the continent. Rains in the uplands swelling the current. Sediment clouding the shallows. New green growth rising after floodwater retreated. Animals returning to familiar margins. Predators learning where movement collects. It would not feel dramatic in the way modern storytelling likes to make nature dramatic. It would feel patterned, reassuring, almost. Water comes. Water leaves. Life adjusts. Then begins again. Even the sounds of these places would have had a softness to them. Not silence, but layered quiet. Insects humming above reeds. The slight movement of water against roots. A distant call from some unseen creature farther down the channel. Wind passing over the upper branches while the understory remains still. If the interior deserts taught endurance through openness, the river forests taught persistence through recurrence, and everywhere, the land was still connected. That fact continued to matter. A forest was not just a local forest. A river was not just a local river. Their patterns belonged to a continental system. Similar plants, similar animals, and similar ecological structures could appear in regions now separated by oceans, because then they were not separated at all. The supercontinent gave its life forms room to spread and experiment across a shared stage. In this old world, forests and rivers were more than pleasant refuges. They were the places where terrestrial life deepened its complexity. They sheltered amphibians tied to water, reptiles learning greater independence, and synapsids carrying early mammalian possibilities. They fed the air. They stored sunlight. They turned flood and sediment into habitat. And while they seemed calm from within, another force was always present beneath them, pressing upward from below. Fire, magma, faulting, and heat were still writing their own slow script under the roots and riverbanks of Pangea. Beneath the forests, beneath the rivers, beneath even the oldest stones exposed to the sky, the earth of Pangea remained active in a way that no landscape could fully conceal. The supercontinent may have seemed broad and settled from above, but it rested over a restless interior. Heat moved through the mantle below. Pressure gathered. The crust flexed, strained, and answered in the long language of tectonics. This deep activity did not stay hidden forever. It rose through faults, through cracks, through lines of weakness in the joined land, and where it reached the surface, it brought fire. Volcanoes were part of the pulse of this ancient world. Not always dramatic in the immediate sense, not always exploding in a single unforgettable instant, but persist, influential, and woven into the fabric of planetary change. Some would have risen along fault systems created during collision or later strain. Others fed lava flows that spread over large areas, slowly hardening into dark rock under open sky. Over long ages, repeated eruptions could build plateaus, change drainage, bury valleys, and reset entire local ecosystems. If you had been standing many miles away from one of these volcanic regions, you might first have noticed it in the light. A haze at the horizon, a smudging of color above distant land, then perhaps a faint smell carried by the wind, sharp and mineral, almost metallic in the throat. At night, the far edge of the world might flicker with a dim orange pulse, not constant, only enough to suggest that the ground itself was lit from within somewhere beyond sight. There is something humbling in that image. A forest in the foreground, damp and still. A river slipping past roots and stone. Insects moving in the warm dark. And, beyond all of it, a distant volcanic line quietly remaking the crust. Pangea was full of these layered realities. Calm at one scale, violent at another, and patient at every scale that mattered most. Ancient lava flows, preserved in rock, tell part of the story. Ash beds tell another. They reveal that eruptions were not rare interruptions. They were recurring facts of the landscape. Some may have been gentle enough in behavior, sending out rivers of molten rock that cooled in broad sheets. Others were more explosive, lifting ash and gas high into the atmosphere, darkening local skies and spreading fine material across wide areas. Both styles mattered. One shaped the land directly. The other altered air, light, water, and climate. Where ash settled, it could leave behind more than ruin. Volcanic material often carries minerals that later enrich the soil. Once heat had passed and the surface cooled, plant life could return to these darkened grounds with surprising persistence. First, sparse growth, then thicker cover, then perhaps in time a fully restored ecosystem. In this way, fire and fertility were sometimes linked. A forest could be buried, and later the same region might host another generation of roots, fed partly by what the eruption left behind. Nature is very good at making use of old endings. Volcanoes also changed the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide released during eruptions contributed to long-term warming, while sulfur-rich emissions could at times cool the surface for shorter intervals by scattering sunlight. The balance between these effects would have varied from event to event and from age to age. But taken together, they made the climate of Pangaea more variable, more vulnerable to geological influence, and more deeply tied to what was happening below the crust. This matters because climate on the supercontinent was already sensitive to geography. Vast interiors tended toward dryness. Coasts depended on seasonal moisture. Mountain belts redirected air and rain. Add volcanic forcing to that arrangement, and the result could be a world of shifting contrasts. A few degrees more warmth in one region, longer drought in another, temporary cooling after a major eruption, different rainfall patterns near coasts and basins. The air itself became a record of geological unrest. You might notice these changes not all at once, but in ordinary signs. A river running lower than expected, forest edges retreating, more dust in the sky at sunset. A season arriving a little differently from the one before. That is often how large planetary change appears from within, not as a loud declaration, but as subtle alteration repeated until it becomes impossible to ignore. Fire on the land may also have followed volcanic influence. Forests rich in dry plant matter, resinous growth, and seasonal heat would not have been immune to burning. Lightning from storms could ignite vegetation. Hot ejecta or nearby flows might do the same. Across parts of Pangaea, wildfires likely moved through forest belts and drier woodlands from time to time, clearing old growth and opening space for renewal. Even this had a rhythm. Destruction, cooling, regrowth, ash, then shoots, blackened trunks, then green return. There is a strange comfort in this cycle when viewed from enough distance, not because loss is pleasant, but because the earth keeps moving forward through it. A burned slope becomes a place of first growth. A cooled lava field cracks and gathers dust. Mosses and primitive plants arrive. Then larger forms follow. The planet never wastes a surface for long. In some volcanic landscapes of Pangaea, the ground itself may have felt newly unfinished. Fresh basalt underfoot. Steam lingering near vents after rain. Water diverted into new paths by hardened lava. Entire valleys changed in shape. Rivers forced to find another course. Wetlands cut off in one place and born in another. This is one of the most profound ways volcanism reshapes ecosystems. It does not only burn, it rearranges. And in rearranging, it asks every living thing nearby to adapt. Predators would follow prey into newly favorable ground. Herbivores would drift toward fresh plant growth in ash-enriched soils. Insects would return to early vegetation. Amphibians might struggle if waterways changed too suddenly, while reptiles and synapsids, with broader tolerance for dry or shifting conditions, could sometimes do better. Geological change was never outside the story of life. It was one of the engines moving the story forward. The great seams that once brought continents together also held the memory of strain. Over time, some of those zones remained tectonically important. Heat rising beneath the crust could exploit weaknesses in the old, joined land. Faults formed. Some remained quiet for long intervals. Others opened pathways for magma. What looked from the surface like stable continental interior could, on deeper timescales, be a place where future change was already preparing itself. This is important, because Pangaea was not a final arrangement. Even while it existed as one immense landmass, the same internal forces that built it were beginning, very slowly, to work against its unity. Before any ocean reopened, before any dramatic separation became visible, there had to be stress. There had to be thinning. There had to be heat pushing upward, testing where the crust might one day yield. Volcanoes were among the first visible hints of that deeper intention. Imagine a long, quiet rift valley in its earliest form, though not yet a sea, not yet a final fracture. The land stretches and settles. A line of volcanic vents appears. The horizon grows irregular with dark cones. Basalt spreads across low ground. Lakes may form in subsiding basins. To the creatures living nearby, it might simply feel like another landscape in a very large world. But to us, looking back, it reads as an early sentence in the breakup to come. Some of the most dramatic volcanic events connected with the broader history of Pangaea arrived later, near the close of the Permian, when enormous eruptions in what is now Siberia released vast quantities of lava and gas. That catastrophe belongs more fully to a later chapter. But even before such extremes, the link between volcanism and transformation had already been established. Fire below was always capable of reaching upward and changing the terms of life above. If you had watched an eruption from a safe distance, the experience would not only have been visual. The ground might tremble lightly before the main event. The air could feel tense, as though holding something. Then ash climbing into the sky, dark against late light. Lightning flickering inside the plume, fine particles drifting outward. Perhaps a dimming of the sun for a time, and later, a strange color at sunset. Afterward, a silence, not empty, but expectant. The kind of silence that comes after something ancient has spoken. And then, with remarkable reliability, life would begin again. Seeds and spores settling. Water returning to channels. Insects reappearing. Fresh growth touching the edges of cooled rock. The pulse of the planet, once destructive, becoming creative again by stages. This is one of the gentlest truths in Earth history. Renewal rarely arrives all at once. It comes first as a small green insistence. So the volcanism of Pangaea was never merely scenery for a dramatic sky. It shaped mountains, redirected rivers, altered soils, changed climate, and hinted at the fractures to come. It reminded every forest, Every desert, every wetland, and every creature that the ground beneath them was part of a larger living system. The supercontinent may have seemed whole, but its wholeness was always temporary. Heat below never stopped moving. Faults never forgot their weakness. And under the quiet landscapes of river and root, the first conditions of future separation were already gathering. Slowly, steadily, far below the sleeping stone. For millions of years, Pangaea seemed whole. Its rivers continued their patient work. Its forests followed water. Its deserts expanded and withdrew with the slow breathing of climate. Its creatures spread across one connected stage. But beneath that appearance of wholeness, the deep machinery of the planet had not paused. Heat still pressed upward from below. Old seams in the crust remained zones of weakness. And eventually, in ways far too slow for any single creature to notice, the supercontinent began to loosen. At first, the change would not have looked like the breaking of a world. It would have looked like long valleys forming where the crust stretched and thinned. The land, once compressed by old collisions, now began to experience another kind of motion. Instead of being pushed together, parts of it were being drawn apart. Cracks appeared. Faults deepened. Magma found pathways upward through widening fractures. In some places, volcanic activity marked these new lines, as though the earth were sketching the first rough edges of future oceans. If you had stood near one of these early rift zones, the landscape might have felt subtly unsettled even on a quiet day. The ground could seem broader and lower than the neighboring highlands, as if the continent had begun to exhale into itself. Long valleys opened between raised shoulders of land. Lakes may have gathered in the depressions. Rivers changed course to follow the new low ground. Dark basalt from volcanic flows spread across parts of the rift floor. It would not yet have looked like a divided planet. It would have looked like a continent learning a new shape. These changes altered climate in gentle but meaningful ways. Where new basins formed, water could collect and create greener corridors. Rainfall patterns shifted around rising shoulders of land and subsiding valleys. Some regions near the rifts may have become more favorable to plant growth, while areas deeper in the continental interior remained dry or grew drier still. It is one of the quieter truths of geological change that the world does not transform evenly. One place opens into wetlands. Another hardens into heat. One valley gathers life. Another loses it. As the crust continued to stretch, the atmosphere responded too. Winds changed direction around new topography. Moisture found different pathways inland. Seasonal rain could reach some emerging lowlands more easily than before. Other regions, cut off by shifting geography, were left in deeper drought. Life adjusted as it always had, moving where it could, lingering where water remained, disappearing where conditions became too difficult. Pangaea was still one landmass, but for the first time in a very long while, true barriers were beginning to appear within it. Plants and animals that had once wandered widely across open, connected terrain now encountered long valleys, fresh uplands, volcanic province, and widening water bodies. These were not yet the great oceans of the modern world, but they were enough to begin separating populations. Over time, Such separations matter. A creature living near one basin experiences a different future from its relative living on another side of the same continent. Evolution often begins in these quiet partings. And then, while the land was already under strain, the living world faced something far harsher than mere rearrangement. During the late Permian, around 252 million years ago, the Earth entered one of the most severe crises in its history. The event is often called the Great Dying, and even now the name feels almost too heavy for a calm voice. So it may be better to think of it as a time when the planet became difficult in nearly every direction at once. Massive volcanic eruptions in what is now Siberia released astonishing volumes of lava and gas over extended spans of time. These eruptions, known as the Siberian Traps, were not ordinary in scale. They spread fire across huge regions and poured carbon dioxide and other gases into the atmosphere. Scientists believe this contributed to intense greenhouse warming, disruption of weather systems, acidifying conditions in some environments, and severe stress in both marine and terrestrial ecosystems. When the Earth changes too quickly and too broadly, life cannot always keep pace. On Pangaea, the effects of this crisis would have been felt through air, water, and silence. Temperatures rose. The already harsh interior of the supercontinent became more severe. Rainfall patterns shifted. Drought expanded in some places. Rivers shrank. Forests that had once thickened along coasts and lowlands retreated under prolonged stress. Wetlands diminished. Dust moved farther through the air. The world would not have turned empty overnight, but its richness would have thinned, season after season, until absence itself became part of the landscape. The oceans suffered too. Warming reduced oxygen in marine waters, creating broad stressed zones where many creatures could no longer survive. Shallow ecosystems changed. Long-established lineages vanished. On land, dominant groups that had shaped much of the Permian world declined or disappeared. Many synapsids were lost. Amphibians tied closely to dependable water struggled badly. Insects, which had endured so much of Earth's earlier history, experienced one of the few great collapses known in their long story. It is difficult to imagine such a world without making it feel frightening, but there is another way to see it. Picture not a sudden apocalypse, but a long dimming. A river that no longer floods as it once did. Forest edges turning sparse. Fewer tracks in the mud. A silence where there had once been a steady hum of life. Heat lingering later into the evening. Fine ash or dust in the morning light. The same landscape still present, but thinner, quieter, more exhausted. In deep time, catastrophe often arrives as attrition. And yet, life did not vanish. It never quite does. Even in this most difficult chapter, certain forms endured by being small, efficient, flexible, and persistent. Some synapsids survived. Reptiles better adapted to dryness and variable conditions continued on. Hardy plants held on in refuges where enough moisture and stability remained. Rivers that still flowed became precious. Shaded valleys, coastal margins, and resilient patches of vegetation turned into quiet shelters for the future. There is something moving about those survivors. They were not the grandest animals of their age. They were not the ones that had seemed most secure during easier times. They were the ones that could bend. The ones that required less. The ones able to continue in a world stripped of abundance. That pattern repeats through Earth's history. When the planet becomes severe, endurance often matters more than dominance. As the worst of the crisis eased, the supercontinent remained scarred. Recovery was slow, very slow. For long stretches, the land would have looked sparse compared with earlier ages. Open ground spread where dense ecosystems had once stood. The rivers that endured became even more important as green lines through a harder world. Small plants returned first, in many places. Then more established vegetation followed. Animal communities rebuilt gradually, filling empty niches left by extinction. The world was quieter than before, but not finished. In a strange way, the breakup of Pangea and the Great Dying belonged together in the imagination, even though they were not the same process. Both remind us that the supercontinent was never truly stable. Its land was shifting. Its air was vulnerable to geological force. Its life was deeply tied to climate and chemistry. The joined world that had once allowed such broad movement and flourishing diversity also carried enormous risk when stress spread across its connected systems. A world united can share abundance widely. It can also share crisis. Still, even after this long ordeal, the first stages of continental separation continued. Rift valleys widened little by little. Basins deepened. Some gathered lakes and river networks. In time, water from the surrounding seas would begin to enter new openings, and the first true outlines of future oceans would start to appear. But at this stage, much of Pangaea still endured as one immense landmass. The fracture had begun, not the final division. If you had stood there in the aftermath of the Great Crisis, you might have sensed both loss and possibility. The air perhaps drier than in earlier ages. Forests thinner in many regions. More open land. More exposed sediment. Yet along a riverbank, there would still be movement. A small animal drinking in the shallows. Insects returning to a patch of green. Wind carrying seeds or spores across recovering ground. The earth, even after the deepest strain, had not stopped trying again. That may be the quiet lesson of this chapter. Pangaea did not break in one moment, and life did not return in one moment either. Both processes unfolded slowly, with pauses, reversals, and long stretches of uncertainty. Continents separated the way dawn arrives on a cloudy morning, gradually enough that you only notice when the light has already changed. Ecosystems recovered the same way, first as hints, then as patterns, and only much later as something that could be called fullness. So, the single great continent moved into its later age with cracks in its body and emptier spaces in its living world. The old order had been reduced. New paths were opening. Across rift valleys, river corridors, and recovering forests. The descendants of survivors were beginning to shape another future. They did not know they were preparing the age of dinosaurs, or preserving the line that would one day lead to mammals. They were only living through the long quiet after fire. But sometimes that is enough. Sometimes the future begins with whatever remains. After the long strain of extinction and recovery, Pangaea entered one of the most important quiet phases in the history of life. The supercontinent was no longer the same lush world it had once been, yet it was still vast, still connected in many directions, and still capable of carrying life across distances that are hard to picture today. The old order had thinned. The new one had not fully arrived. And in that in-between world, the future began to take shape with remarkable patience. The recovering landscapes of the Triassic were not empty, though they may have felt more spacious than the older Permian world. Forests returned, but in altered forms. Conifers spread across many regions, their needle-like leaves well suited to climates marked by seasonal dryness and uneven rainfall. Seed ferns and cycads occupied warmer belts. Along river valleys, greener strips cut through harsher land, and wherever water remained dependable, life gathered again with quiet determination. The supercontinent still offered one immense stage, and now many ecological roles stood open, waiting to be filled. Small synapsids, the survivors from older lineages, continued on in this new world. Some were insect eaters, quick and modest, living beneath the notice of larger animals. Their smallness helped them endure. They required less food, less territory, and could make use of sheltered corners in recovering ecosystems. Over immense spans of time, some of these descendants moved a little closer toward what we would recognize as mammalian traits. Not fully there, not yet, but carrying the quiet inheritance of more efficient jaws, differentiated teeth, and increasingly complex ways of living on land. At the same time, reptiles expanded into many of the spaces left behind by extinction. Freed from old competition, they diversified across the supercontinent. Some remained small and swift. Others began testing larger body sizes, different diets, and new ways of moving through forests, floodplains, and open country. Among these growing reptilian branches were the early ancestors of the first true dinosaurs. At first, they were not the giants of later imagination. They were smaller, lighter, and in some places probably easy to overlook beside larger contemporaries. But the pattern had begun. There is something almost gentle about their arrival when viewed through deep time. The age of dinosaurs did not burst onto the planet all at once. It gathered slowly, through lineages finding opportunity in a recovering world. A small bipedal reptile crossing a floodplain at dusk would not announce an empire to come. It would simply be another survivor, making use of available ground, available food, and a climate still teaching every creature how to endure. The geography of Pangaea helped this process enormously. Because so much land remained connected, populations could spread widely. A lineage that evolved in one region could, over generations beyond counting, extend into what are now very distant parts of the globe. River systems acted as green corridors. Transitional belts linked coasts to drier interiors. Even the deserts, though difficult, were crossed by scattered pathways of life where water or seasonal vegetation allowed movement. In this sense, The supercontinent remained a vast laboratory, one where adaptation could travel. You can imagine a recovering floodplain in the early morning. The light still low, conifers casting long shadows. A river moving through broad, silted ground left fertile by earlier floods. Small reptiles leaving narrow tracks along the edge of the water. Insects rising in soft clouds above reeds. A synapsid slipping back into cover as the day warms. Nothing dramatic. Only the steady layering of a new ecosystem. But inside that stillness, new evolutionary experiments were already underway. As rifting continued, the land itself kept adjusting. Long fractures widened little by little. Some basins became more pronounced. Lakes expanded and contracted. In places, lowlands collected water and fed new belts of vegetation. Elsewhere, uplift or shifting drainage altered the distribution of rivers. These geological changes did not end the connectedness of Pangaea immediately, but they began teaching the supercontinent how to become many lands instead of one. The future Atlantic, for example, existed first as a possibility in stretched crust and volcanic rift zones before it became an ocean. This gradual division mattered to life. As landscapes changed, populations were separated more often than before. A river system, redirected by tectonic motion, could isolate communities. A widening basin could become a persistent barrier. New coastlines could create fresh climates along once inland areas. It is thought that these changing boundaries helped shape the next phases of diversification: isolation and reconnection, dryness and moisture, uplift and erosion. All of it continued feeding evolution as surely as food and shelter did. And still, echoes of the old supercontinent remained everywhere. Mountains raised during the assembly of Pangaea still stood, though erosion had softened many of them. Deserts in the interior still reflected the challenge of living far from ocean moisture. Winds continued carrying dust across broad distances. Rivers still tied large regions together. Even as separation began, the world retained the habits of its unified past. The supercontinent was learning to come apart, but it had not forgotten how to be whole. This long farewell is part of what makes Pangaea so compelling. It was not merely an ancient arrangement that existed and vanished. It actively shaped what came after. The distribution of fossils across now separated continents still reflects the time when those lands were joined. Mountain belts, now divided by oceans, still align in their deeper structure. Sedimentary layers, coal deposits, red desert beds, and matching rock formations all preserve pieces of the old continental puzzle. Earth still carries the memory of that union in its body. Scientists study these clues with patience, reading the planet the way one might read a weathered manuscript. A fossil in South America resembles one found in Africa. A mountain system on one coast matches the geology of another shore an ocean away. Ancient river deposits line up across continents. None of these things alone tells the whole story. Together, they whisper the same conclusion. Once, this was one connected Earth. The living world carries that memory too, though more indirectly. The conditions created by Pangaea helped shape the pathways of reptiles, synapsids, early marine communities, and the ecosystems that would eventually support dinosaurs and later mammals. The supercontinent influenced winds, rainfall, deserts, forests, and migration routes. It determined which environments touched, which populations met, and which lineages had room to spread. In that sense, even after the land broke apart, its influence continued walking in the bodies of the creatures that inherited the changed world. If you step back far enough, the entire story begins to feel like breathing. The earth gathers its land together. It holds it for a while. Mountains rise. Forests spread. Deserts harden. Oceans shape the coasts. Life responds. Then slowly the land loosens again. Cracks widen. New waters arrive. Population divide. New paths emerge. The rhythm is vast, but not violent in every moment. Much of it happens with extraordinary softness, too slowly to see, yet powerful enough to reorganize the face of the world. By the later stages of Pangea's unraveling, the continents that would one day become North America, South America, Africa, Europe, and others were already beginning to move towards separate destinies. Oceans would continue opening. Coastlines would grow longer and more complex. Climate systems would become more varied as land and sea mixed in new ways. Isolation would accelerate diversification. The modern world was being prepared piece by piece. But even then, all of it still emerged from the memory of the single land that came before. There is something calming in that continuity. The present Earth, with all its separated continents and familiar oceans, is not a different planet from the one we have been visiting. It is the same world, only later in the story. The mountains outside modern cities, the desert winds across open land, the layered rocks exposed in cliffs, even the fossils found far from where similar bones rest elsewhere. All of these are quiet reminders that the earth remembers its older shapes. So, when we think about Pangea, we are not thinking only about a lost map. We are thinking about a phase in the life of the planet that helped set the foundations for everything that followed. It shaped climate. It shaped geography. It shaped movement, survival, extinction, and renewal. It gave the living world one enormous connected stage, then slowly turned that one stage into many. And in doing so, it left behind a deeper understanding of what Earth really is, not fixed, not finished, but always becoming. Now the coastlines are different. The oceans are wider. The forests are new. The creatures are new. The air itself has changed many times. Yet, beneath the modern arrangement, the old story remains. Stone still remembers collision. Fossils still remember connection. Rivers still remember old pathways through joined lands. And somewhere in the broad patience of the planet, the same slow forces continue their work, lifting, opening, drifting, reshaping, never hurried, never truly at rest. So as this journey comes to a close, you can let the image settle gently. One ancient continent beneath one wide sky. Forests breathing along its rivers. Deserts glowing under dry light. Volcanoes pulsing at the horizon. Cracks opening with impossible slowness. Life thinning, returning, and changing. Then the long drift apart, not as an ending exactly, but as a transformation. The world we know was hidden inside that older world all along, waiting to unfold in silence over millions of years. And perhaps that is the most comforting thought of all. The earth has changed beyond counting, yet it remains continuous. Every age folds into the next. Nothing stands still, but nothing is wholly lost either. The old world survives in traces, in echoes, in foundations, in living descendants, and in the patient logic of the planet itself. You have been listening to a story about deep time, but deep time is also the story beneath your own feet. It is there in every stone path, every mountain skyline, every grain of sand once carried by older winds. The supercontinent is gone now as a shape, but not as a memory. It lingers in geology, in fossils, in the arrangement of continents, and in the quiet awareness that Earth is larger, older, and gentler in its changes than we usually allow ourselves to feel. So let that old world drift softly into the distance now. Let the rivers continue their journey. Let the forests darken into evening. Let the sky widen over the last outline of joined land. And let the planet keep turning, patient as ever, carrying its ancient stories forward into the night. Good night.